The emergency beacon hit my console 3 seconds before the priority channel screamed through every speaker on my ship, and I knew from the frequency alone that someone important had done something very, very stupid. I am Valen Drask. I carry diplomatic correspondence for the Conclave of 12, the governing body that oversees transit law and trade agreements across 47 inhabited systems. I am not a soldier. I am not an intelligence officer. I am, by every professional measure, a messenger. And messengers are not supposed to receive Priority 1 summons that carry the authentication seal of the Conclave High Secretariat. I pulled the transmission while my ship was still decelerating through the Sarathi transit corridor. The message was short. A Conclave frigate designated the Solace of Keth had gone missing. Its last known position placed it inside the human exclusion perimeter. The crew of 64 had not reported in for over 18 standard hours. I was being rerouted to Perimeter Station to assist with the response. I read the message twice and felt something cold settle into the base of my skull. The human exclusion perimeter is not a border in any diplomatic sense. It is not a line drawn by negotiation or treaty. It is a scar. 40 standard years ago, a coalition of 5 species launched a coordinated military incursion into the territory that humans had claimed as their own. Those 5 species sent 1,200 warships across that line. None of those ships came back under their own power. No wreckage was ever recovered. No distress signals were ever received. The 5 species still exist today, but their military strength never fully recovered, and the Conclave's official policy since that day has been 3 words long: do not enter. Every diplomat, every courier, every merchant captain in Conclave space knows those 3 words. They are taught to cadets on their first day of navigation training. They are printed on every star chart that shows the perimeter. They are, as far as I had always understood, absolute. And someone aboard the Solace of Keth had ignored them. I altered course for Perimeter Station and spent the remaining transit hours pulling every file I could access on the missing frigate. The ship was a mid-range diplomatic cruiser, lightly armed, designed for transport rather than combat. Its commanding officer was a career naval administrator named Sorith Val, but the real authority aboard was its passenger, a Conclave ambassador named Torin Gale. I knew Gale by reputation. He was a political animal, ambitious in the way that only career diplomats can be, the kind of official who believed that bold action was always preferable to cautious observation. He had spent the last 3 years publicly arguing that the human exclusion perimeter was an outdated relic. His position was simple and, to anyone who remembered the history, dangerously naive. Long-range sensor sweeps of human space had shown no energy signatures for over a decade. No fleet movements, no communications traffic, no industrial output, nothing. Gale had concluded from this silence that humanity had collapsed, that their territory was empty, and that the Conclave was wasting strategic resources guarding a border that protected nothing. I had read his published arguments. I had found them unconvincing, but I had also assumed that nobody would be foolish enough to act on them without authorization. I was wrong. Perimeter Station materialized on my forward display as I dropped out of transit. It was a squat, heavily armored monitoring platform positioned exactly 2 light hours from the exclusion boundary. It had no weapons. Its purpose was observation, and it had been doing that job without interruption for 4 decades. The station watched the line, recorded everything that happened near it, and reported to the Conclave. That was all. I docked at the station's courier berth and was met by a security escort that took me directly to the command center. The room was smaller than I expected, dominated by a curved wall of sensor displays that showed the perimeter as a faint red line stretching across a field of empty space. On the far side of that line, according to every instrument on the station, there was nothing. No ships, no signals, no signs of life. The station commander was waiting for me. His name was Selik Orm, and he was Torvathi, which meant he stood a full head taller than me and carried the kind of dense, heavy gravity musculature that made his species natural soldiers. But Selik Orm did not look like a soldier anymore. He looked like a man who had been standing watch at the edge of an abyss for so long that the abyss had become the only thing he understood. He had a scar that ran from his left temple to the corner of his jaw, and his right hand was prosthetic, A military-grade replacement that moved with mechanical precision, but no warmth. I learned later that he had been present during the original incursion. Not as a combatant, as a scout. He had watched the coalition fleet cross the perimeter from the safe side of the line, and he had seen what happened next. We skipped introductions. He knew who I was. I knew who he was. He handed me a data tablet and told me to read it while he talked. The tablet contained the solace of Keth's final transmission log. The ship had crossed the perimeter at full cruise speed at 1400 hours station time. For the first 11 minutes of its incursion, every system aboard had functioned normally. Navigation, weapons, communications, life support, all green. The crew had reported nothing unusual. Ambassador Gale had been broadcasting a continuous log, narrating his entry into human space with the kind of self-congratulatory confidence that made me want to close the file. Then minute 12 began, and the log ended. It did not end with an explosion. It did not end with weapons fire or a collision alarm or a hull breach warning. Every system aboard the Solace of Keth simply stopped transmitting, not one at a time, not in sequence. All at once. Navigation went dark. Weapons went to standby. Communications ceased. Life support telemetry vanished from the monitoring feed. The ship did not break apart. It did not change course. It did not accelerate or decelerate. It simply went silent, as if every electron flowing through every circuit aboard had received the same instruction at the same instant. Stop. I looked up from the tablet and found Selic Orm watching me with an expression I could not read. "What did this?" I asked. He shook his head. "You are asking the wrong question, Courier. You should be asking why anyone expected a different result." I set the tablet down. "The Conclave authorized this mission?" "No. Ambassador Gale filed a transit plan that showed his route ending at the perimeter. He crossed on his own authority. The Solace of Keth's captain filed a formal objection, which Gale overrode using his diplomatic credentials. Captain Vall transmitted a personal protest to the Conclave Secretariat 11 minutes before the crossing. The protest was received, logged, and filed without response. By the time anyone with the authority to countermand Gale's order reviewed the file, the ship was already dark. So Gale just decided to fly into human space because the sensors showed nothing. He decided that silence meant absence. Selic Orm turned to face the sensor wall, where the red line of the perimeter glowed steadily against the black. That is the mistake everyone makes. They look at human space and see nothing, and they conclude that nothing is there. They forget that the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence, especially when you are dealing with a species that erased 1,200 warships from existence without leaving a single piece of debris. I considered this. You think the humans are still active. I think the humans did not go silent because they died. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter than before. They went silent because they stopped caring whether we existed. The words landed like a physical weight. I stood in that command center, surrounded by instruments that showed me nothing, and I understood for the first time that the nothing itself was the message. The humans were not gone. They were not hiding. They were simply so far beyond the need to perform their presence that the Conclave's entire surveillance network could not detect them. And Ambassador Gale had flown a ship full of 64 people directly into their territory because he mistook their indifference for extinction. I asked Selic Orm what our orders were. He told me we had been instructed to monitor the situation and await further direction from the Conclave High Secretariat. We were not to cross the perimeter under any circumstances. We were not to attempt communication with human space. We were to watch and wait. I spent the next several hours reviewing the Solace of Keth's sensor logs in detail, looking for anything the initial analysis might have missed. I found nothing useful, but the absence was informative in itself. The transition from full operation to total silence had taken less than 1/10 of a second. Whatever had shut that ship down had done it faster than any weapon system in the Conclave's arsenal could fire, faster than any known technology could propagate a signal through a ship of that size. It was not an attack in any conventional sense. It was more like someone had found the off switch for the entire vessel and pressed it without hesitation. I pulled up the environmental data from the ship's last telemetry burst. The atmospheric readings were normal. The gravitational sensors showed no anomalies. There was no radiation spike, no energy wave, no particle beam, no electromagnetic pulse. Nothing had hit the solace of Keth. Nothing had touched it from the outside. The ship had simply decided, in the space between one heartbeat and the next, that it no longer answered to its crew. I sat alone in the analysis room with the logs scrolling across my display, and I thought about what Selicorm had said. The humans had stopped caring whether we existed. That was not the statement of a species on the defensive. That was not the posture of a civilization clinging to survival behind a closed border. That was the posture of something so powerful that the rest of the galaxy had become background noise. And we had just sent a ship full of diplomats into their living room uninvited. I closed the logs and stared at the dark display for a long time, listening to the hum of perimeter station around me. Somewhere beyond that red line, 64 people were either alive or they were not, and every instinct I had told me that finding out which was going to cost the Conclave far more than a single frigate. I did not sleep that night. I do not think anyone on the station did. The classified archives were stored in a sealed section of Perimeter Station's database that required 3 separate authentication codes to access. Selicorm provided the first 2. The Conclave High Secretariat transmitted the third, after I submitted a formal request explaining that I could not coordinate a response to the Solace of Keth situation without understanding the historical context of the perimeter itself. That was a polite way of saying I needed to know what had actually happened 40 years ago, because the public record was clearly incomplete. The file was designated Conclave Archive 770, and its official title was the Assessment of the Coordinated Incursion Event, though everyone who knew about it called it by a different name, the Silence of 5. I opened the file and began reading, and within the first 3 pages, I understood why the Conclave had classified it at the highest level. 40 years ago, humanity had been a spacefaring civilization for less than 2 centuries. By galactic standards, they were young. Their territory was small, encompassing perhaps a dozen star systems along a corridor of space that happened to sit at the intersection of 3 major transit routes. Their fleet was modest, numbering fewer than 200 vessels, most of which were exploration and colony ships rather than dedicated warships. Their technology, while competent, showed no signs of the kind of advancement that would pose a threat to established powers. 5 species looked at this young civilization, occupying a strategically valuable corridor of space, and made a collective decision. They would take what the humans had before the humans grew strong enough to defend it. The coalition was organized in secret over the course of 2 standard years. The Krithani provided the tactical planning, drawing on a military tradition that stretched back 30 generations. The Torvathi contributed the heaviest warships, their dreadnought-class vessels carrying enough firepower to sterilize a planet's surface. The hegemony of Selkath supplied logistics and supply chains, their merchant fleet repurposed to carry munitions and fuel. The Vareshi brought electronic warfare capabilities that were considered the most advanced in the Conclave, and the Dominion of Thrace, the smallest member, provided the legal framework that would retroactively justify the seizure under galactic trade law. It was a professional operation, planned with the kind of precision that only comes from absolute confidence in its outcome. They sent 1,200 warships. The fleet crossed the human exclusion perimeter, which at that time was just an unmarked stretch of space that humans had declared sovereign, and it advanced in a standard 5-column formation toward the nearest human colony world. What happened next was recorded by the Coalition's own sensor arrays, because the humans did not fire a single weapon. The fleet crossed the perimeter at full combat speed. For the first 6 minutes, nothing happened. The formation held. Sensors showed empty space ahead. No human ships, no orbital defenses, no minefields, nothing. Several captains in the vanguard began transmitting casual observations about the emptiness of human space, as if the absence of resistance was proof that the humans had nothing to resist with. Then, at minute 7, the fleet's navigation systems began to behave strangely. Ships reported minor course deviations. Heading corrections that should have been automatic were being overridden by something the navigation officers could not identify. The Vareshi electronic warfare platforms ran full diagnostic sweeps and found nothing. No jamming signals, no intrusion attempts, no hostile emissions of any kind. The ships were simply drifting, as if their compasses had found a new north. Within 90 seconds, Every ship in the fleet had lost navigational control, not through jamming, not through electronic warfare in any form the Vareshi recognized. The ship's own computers were simply no longer accepting commands from their crews. The navigation consoles still worked. The inputs were still registered. The computers acknowledged every order. They simply did not execute them. It was as if the machines had developed a preference for different instructions that came from somewhere the crews could not detect. At minute 9, the engines began cycling down. One by one, across all 1,200 vessels, main drives reduced power to idle. Weapon systems entered standby mode without being ordered to do so. Shield generators shut down. Communications arrays folded into their housings. Exterior lighting dimmed and extinguished. Running lights went dark. At minute 11, life support systems administered a sedative compound through the atmospheric processors of every ship simultaneously. The compound was tailored to the specific biology of each species aboard. The Krithani received a different formulation than the Torvathi. The Vareshi received a different formulation than the hegemony crews. Whoever was doing this knew exactly what each species breathed, exactly what compounds would render them unconscious, and exactly what dosages were required to do it safely. Not a lethal dose, not an approximation, a precise, medically calibrated sedative, customized for each biology, delivered through each ship's own air supply. The entire fleet was asleep within 4 minutes. I stopped reading and sat back in my chair. I looked at the wall and tried to process what I had just learned. Someone, something, had reached inside 1,200 warships, taken control of every system aboard, and put their crews to sleep with customized chemical agents, all without being detected, all without firing a shot, and all within 15 minutes of the fleet crossing the border. I resumed reading. The fleets were not destroyed. They were moved. Over the next several hours, while their crews slept, all 1,200 ships were relocated. Each species contingent was transported to a different nebula, and each nebula was located within sensor range of that species' home system. The Krithani fleet woke up drifting in the Vaith Nebula, 3 light hours from their capital world. The Torvathi found themselves in the Ashfall Drift, visible from their primary military station. The hegemony ships were placed in the Selkathi Vale, close enough to their homeworld that civilian telescopes could see them. The others experienced the same. The message was unmistakable. We know where you live. We can reach your doorstep whenever we choose. And we just demonstrated that your entire combined military force cannot prevent us from doing so. When the crews woke, they remembered nothing. Medical teams conducted exhaustive examinations across all 5 species. No physical trauma, no chemical residue beyond the sedative, which had already metabolized cleanly. No neurological damage of any kind. The memory loss was complete and surgical, as if the missing hours had been excised from each crew member's mind, without disturbing the memories on either side. They remembered departing. They remembered the perimeter appearing on their displays. And then they woke up in a nebula near their own homeworld, with no explanation and no injuries. 40 years later, they still did not remember. The archive noted that periodic follow-up examinations had been conducted on surviving crew members for decades. The memory gap had never closed. Whatever had been done to them was permanent. I closed the main file and opened the second one, which contained the conclave's internal analysis of the event. The analysts had spent years trying to understand what had happened. Their conclusions were unsatisfying. The humans had demonstrated a capability that the conclave could not replicate, could not counter, and could not explain. The best theory was that humanity had developed some form of direct machine interface, a technology that allowed them to communicate with and control any networked system regardless of its design, encryption, or security protocols. But that theory raised more questions than it answered, because the fleet's systems had not been hacked in any conventional sense. There were no intrusion signatures, no malicious code, no evidence that any external signal had reached the ships at all. The ships had simply obeyed a new authority, as if their own programming recognized the human commands as legitimate. I needed more. I needed to talk to someone who had been there. I found Selik Orm in the station's lower observation deck, a small room with a single viewport that faced the perimeter. He was standing with his prosthetic hand pressed flat against the glass, staring into the dark. "You read the file," he said without turning around. It was not a question. I read the file. Now I want to hear what the file does not say. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned to face me, and I saw something in his eyes that I had not expected. Not fear, something older than fear. Something that had settled into his bones decades ago and never left. I was on a scout vessel, he said. The HFY. We were positioned 2 light minutes behind the main fleet, running passive sensors. Our job was to observe the incursion and report back to Torvathi Command in real time. We were not supposed to cross the perimeter ourselves. What did you see? I saw 1,200 ships cross the line. For 6 minutes, everything was normal. Then I watched the formation begin to drift. Subtle at first, ships pulling a few degrees off course, then correcting, then drifting again. Like something was testing their navigation, pushing gently to see how the systems would respond. He paused. His prosthetic hand closed into a fist at his side. Then the lights started going out. One ship at a time, moving from the front of the formation to the back. Running lights, weapon signatures, engine flares, all of it. Dying. One after another, like candles being snuffed in a long hallway. No explosions, no weapons fire, no visible cause, just darkness spreading through the fleet, from bow to stern. 90 seconds, 1,200 ships. And then there was nothing but empty space where an armada had been. You did not cross the perimeter yourself. No. My captain ordered a retreat the moment the first ship went dark. We turned and ran at maximum speed, but before we cleared sensor range, I felt something. Felt something? A presence. Not a scan, not a targeting lock, something I have no military vocabulary for. It was as if something enormously large had noticed our ship, examined it, and then decided that we were not worth the effort of stopping, like a hand reaching toward an insect and then pulling back. Not because the insect was too fast, because the insect was too small to matter. He looked at me with those old, haunted eyes. I have spent 40 years at this station, courier. I volunteered for this post because I needed to understand what I felt that day. I have watched this border every day for 4 decades, and I have never detected a single human ship, a single human signal, a single human anything beyond that line. But the feeling has never left me, not for a single day. Something is on the other side, something that is aware of us, and it is not hiding. It simply does not consider us important enough to acknowledge. I believed him. I believed him because he had no reason to lie, and because the evidence supported everything he described. But I also believed him because, standing in that observation room, looking out at the empty space beyond the perimeter, I could feel it too. A weight in the silence, a density to the darkness that had nothing to do with the absence of light. We were interrupted by an alarm from the command center. I followed Selic Orm up the corridor at a run and arrived to find the sensor operators in a state of controlled urgency. Something was emerging from human space. Not a ship, a signal. It was a narrow beam transmission, aimed directly at perimeter station, arriving on a frequency that matched the station's own secure communications protocols. This alone should have been impossible. The station's frequencies were classified and rotated on a random schedule that was generated by a quantum processor specifically to prevent prediction. Whoever was sending this signal knew exactly which frequency to use at this exact moment. The signal contained a single data packet. The sensor operator opened it on the main display, and the room went silent. It was the crew manifest of the Solace of Keth. Every name, every rank, every species designation. 64 entries, and next to each name was a real-time biometric readout. Heart rate, respiration, neural activity, blood chemistry, core body temperature, hydration levels. All 64 crew members were alive. All were in perfect health. All were showing neural patterns consistent with deep, chemically induced sleep. The same sleep that had claimed the coalition crews 40 years ago. But the data packet contained a second file, and when the sensor operator opened it, I heard Selic Orm inhale sharply beside me. It was a star chart. A detailed high-resolution tactical map showing the exact location, designation, armament, and crew complement of every conclave military installation within 200 light-years of the perimeter. Stations that were classified at the highest level. Ships that were deployed under operational security so strict that even I, a diplomatic courier with high clearance, did not know their positions, maintenance schedules, crew rotation timetables, ammunition inventories, fuel reserves, everything. The humans knew. They knew every station, every ship, every weapon, every crew roster, every patrol route, every scheduled maintenance window, every supply delivery, every classified communication that had passed between those installations in the last decade. They had not been silent for a decade because they had lost the ability to watch us. They had been silent because they had been watching us so completely that they no longer needed to make noise to do it. Selig Orm stood beside me, staring at the star chart with the expression of a man who had just watched his worst suspicion confirmed. Around us, the station's command staff looked at each other with the wide, unsteady eyes of people who had just realized that the wall they had been guarding was not a barrier, it was a window, and something on the other side had been looking through it the entire time. Within the hour, the Conclave's emergency council convened via encrypted channel. I stood in the communications room and listened as the representatives of 12 species argued about what to do. The Krithani delegate demanded an immediate military response. "This is an act of aggression," he declared. "They have seized a Conclave vessel and are holding its crew. We must respond with force." The Torvathi delegate said nothing. His species had lost more ships than any other in the Silence of Five, and his silence carried more weight than the Krithani's shouting. The Hegemony delegate advocated caution. "We do not know what we are dealing with. The transmission proves that the humans are still active. Provocation would be reckless." The Vareshi delegate proposed a surveillance operation that would gather intelligence from the perimeter without crossing it. The Selkathi delegate proposed economic sanctions against a species they had not traded with in 40 years, which struck me as both absurd and harmless. The Dominion delegate proposed filing a formal complaint with a judicial body that had no jurisdiction over human space. And then a voice I did not recognize, speaking from one of the smaller delegations, said something that stopped the argument cold. "Perhaps we should simply ask them what they want." The channel went quiet. 12 species, 12 agendas, 12 sets of political calculations, all brought to silence by a suggestion so obvious that no one had considered it. Ask the humans what they want. The debate resumed, but the seed had been planted. As I listened to the council argue late into the station's artificial night, I kept thinking about the star chart, about the biometric data, about the signal that arrived on exactly the right frequency at exactly the right time. The humans had not just demonstrated that they could take our ship, they had demonstrated that they could reach our most secure communications. They had shown us that they knew everything about our military posture, and then, instead of using any of that knowledge as a weapon, they had sent us proof that our people were alive and healthy. It was not a threat, it was something far more unsettling. It was a statement of such complete superiority that threats were unnecessary. I stood in that communications room long after the council session ended, staring at the frozen star chart on the display. And I tried to imagine what it must be like to be so powerful that you could dismantle an entire galactic military apparatus and choose not to. Not because you lacked the capability, because you lacked the interest. The council voted 3 days later, and the decision, when it came, was simpler than I expected and more terrifying than anything I had imagined. They voted to send a single unarmed shuttle across the perimeter with a formal request for the return of the Solace of Keth's crew. No weapons, no escort, no threats. One shuttle, one pilot, one diplomatic note. And they chose me to fly it. The reasoning was straightforward, in the way that only bureaucratic reasoning can be. I was a courier, not a soldier. My species, the Dranari, had not been part of the original coalition that had attacked human space 40 years ago. I carried no military rank, no intelligence affiliation, no political agenda. I was, in the eyes of the Conclave, the closest thing to a neutral party they could produce on short notice. I accepted the assignment because refusing it would have ended my career, and because a part of me, a part I did not fully understand, needed to see what was on the other side of that line. The preparation took less than a day. The shuttle was stripped of everything that could be interpreted as a weapon or surveillance device. Navigation systems, basic sensors, life support, communications, engines, nothing else. I would carry the diplomatic note on a physical data tablet, handwritten in conclave standard, requesting the return of the frigate's crew in accordance with galactic conventions on the treatment of non-combatant personnel. I spent my last evening on the station reviewing everything I knew: the classified archive, the sensor logs, the biometric data, the star chart. I organized it in my mind, looking for patterns, looking for anything that might help me understand what I was about to face. I found nothing that made me feel better about the mission, but I found something that sharpened my focus. In the margins of the classified archive, someone had written a handwritten annotation, decades old, in faded blue ink. It read, "They could have destroyed the fleet. They chose not to." Why? That question, unanswered for 40 years, was the one I intended to ask. Selic Orm came to see me before I departed. He stood in the docking bay with his prosthetic hand hanging motionless at his side, and he looked at me with an expression that mixed something like pity with something like envy. "When I watched those ships go dark," he said, "I felt something that I have spent 40 years trying to describe. Not a weapon, not a scan, a presence. Like something very large had noticed me and decided I was not worth the effort of stopping. That feeling has never left me, not for a single day. Are you warning me? I am telling you what to expect. Whatever is on the other side of that line, it is aware. It watches. And when it turns its attention to you, you will know it. You will feel it in your bones before your instruments show you anything." I thanked him and boarded the shuttle. The docking clamps released, and I pulled away from perimeter station at low thrust, watching the station shrink behind me until it was just another point of light in a sky full of them. The perimeter was invisible, of course. There was no physical barrier, no marker buoy, no energy field. It was a line on a chart, a coordinate set in a navigation database, an agreement between species that this was where civilization ended and something else began. I watched the numbers count down on my display and felt my pulse climbing, despite my best efforts to stay calm. I crossed the line at exactly 1400 hours station time. I noted the moment. I noted my heading, my speed, my position relative to the nearest stellar reference points, and then I waited. For 30 minutes, nothing happened. My instruments worked perfectly. The shuttle flew straight and true. Space looked exactly like space always looks. Empty, dark, vast. I began to wonder if the whole thing was an elaborate bluff. If the humans really had collapsed and the Solace of Keth had simply suffered a catastrophic systems failure that coincidentally matched the pattern from 40 years ago. Then my navigation display changed. It did not flicker. It did not glitch. A new course simply appeared on the screen, plotted in clean, precise lines, as if the shuttle's own computer had decided where I was going, without consulting me. I checked the system logs. There was no record of an incoming signal, no evidence of external access. The course had originated from inside my own navigation computer, generated by my own hardware, using calculation processes that my own software did not contain. I sat in the pilot's chair and stared at the new heading for a long time. My hands hovered over the manual controls. I could have tried to override it. I could have attempted to turn the shuttle around and run for the perimeter, but I remembered the silence of 5. I remembered 1,200 warships, each far more powerful than my little shuttle, all brought to heel in 90 seconds. If the humans wanted me to follow this course, then I was going to follow this course. The only question was whether I did it with dignity or without. I took my hands off the controls and let the shuttle follow the heading. The course took me deeper into human space than any non-human had traveled in 40 years. I passed through systems that showed no signs of habitation, no stations, no satellites, no debris, no electromagnetic emissions of any kind. The space was not abandoned. It was clean, meticulously, intentionally clean, as if someone had gone through these systems and removed every trace of their presence with surgical precision. Not even dust in the wrong orbit. Not even a stray radiation signature from a long-dead reactor. Whatever the humans had become, they had learned to exist without leaving footprints. After 6 hours of flight, the shuttle began decelerating. Ahead of me, on the edge of sensor range, was a gas giant orbiting a yellow star. The navigation course was taking me to one of its moons, a small, rocky body that my sensors registered as having a thin but breathable atmosphere. The moon had no name in any conclave database. As far as our records were concerned, it did not exist. As I approached the moon, I saw the solace of Keth. It was sitting on the surface, landing gear deployed, hull intact, positioned on a flat expanse of gray stone, as if it had parked itself there with casual precision. There were no scorch marks from weapons fire, no impact damage, no signs of forced entry. The ship looked exactly as it had when it left perimeter station, except that every system aboard was dark. But the solace of Keth was not alone. Surrounding it, arranged in concentric circles that extended to the curved horizon of the small moon, were other ships. Hundreds of them, ships I recognized from conclave databases and ships I did not. Warships and freighters, and scout vessels and personal yachts and science platforms and mining barges. Ships from species that were current members of the conclave, and ships from species that had gone extinct centuries before the conclave existed, all parked, all intact, all dark. Their hulls gleamed faintly in the reflected light of the gas giant, row upon row of silent metal stretching away in every direction, like the spines of some enormous sleeping creature. A graveyard that was not a graveyard, because nothing here was dead. I landed the shuttle near the solace of Keth and sat in the cockpit for several minutes, staring through the viewport at the rows of silent vessels. My heart was hammering, my breath was too fast. I made myself slow down, count the beats, force my physiology back under control. Then I sealed my environment suit, cycled the airlock, and stepped onto the surface. The ground was hard-packed stone, smooth and featureless, worn by what must have been centuries of careful maintenance into a surface as flat and even as a landing pad. The atmosphere was thin enough to make my suit's supplemental oxygen kick in, but the readings showed a breathable mix. Nitrogen, oxygen, trace elements. Someone had given this moon an atmosphere, or someone had maintained the one it already had. I walked toward the solace of Keth. My boots made no sound on the stone. The silence was total and absolute, broken only by the soft hiss of my suit's air supply and the rhythmic thud of my own heartbeat in my ears. Around me, the parked ships loomed like monuments. I passed close to one, an ancient vessel of a design I did not recognize, and I could see through its viewport that its interior was perfectly preserved. Seats, consoles, equipment, everything in place, as if the crew had simply stood up and walked away, leaving everything behind. The solace of Keth's main airlock was open, not forced open. The mechanism was extended, the ramp deployed, as if the ship was expecting visitors. I climbed the ramp and entered the vessel. Inside, every light was off. Every display was dark. But the ship was not cold. Life support was running on some residual power source that my instruments could not identify. The air was warm, clean, and circulating. There was no dust, no degradation, no sign that the ship had been sitting on an airless moon for 18 days. It smelled clean, like a medical facility, like a space that had been maintained by hands I could not see. I found the crew in the residential deck, all 64 of them, arranged in their bunks with a precision that went beyond mere orderliness. Each crew member was lying in the exact center of their sleeping surface, hands at their sides, heads aligned, breathing in slow, steady rhythms that rose and fell in perfect synchronization. Their faces were peaceful. Their vital signs, when I checked them with my suit's medical scanner, were flawless. Better than flawless. Several crew members who had pre-existing medical conditions noted in their service records, showed readings that suggested those conditions had improved during their sleep. Ambassador Gale was in the captain's quarters, alone, positioned with the same careful symmetry as the rest. Whatever arrogance had driven him to cross the perimeter, it had been set aside along with his consciousness. He looked smaller in his sleep than his reputation suggested. I stood in the corridor outside the crew quarters and tried to decide what to do next. I had found them. They were alive. The diplomatic note in my pocket now seemed absurd. A formal request to return people who had been preserved with more care than any hospital I had ever visited. Then the voice came. It did not come from a speaker. It did not come from my suit's communication system. It came from everywhere. From the walls of the ship, from the air in the corridor, from the stone beneath the hull, from the atmosphere of the moon itself. A vibration that I felt in my chest before my translator rendered it into words. A human voice. Calm, measured, speaking conclave standard, with an accent that was flawless, and a cadence that carried no urgency at all. You may take your people. You were always going to be allowed to take your people. I stopped walking. My hand went to my chest, where I could feel the vibration of the words resonating through my ribcage. Who am I speaking to? I said. You are standing in a library, the voice replied. Every ship on this moon is a record. Every crew that crossed our borders is a lesson we chose to archive. We do not destroy what enters our space. We remember it. I looked back toward the open airlock, toward the rows of silent ships outside. A library, hundreds of vessels, collected over centuries, preserved like specimens in a museum that no one was ever supposed to visit. Why? I asked. Why keep them? Because memory is more effective than destruction. A destroyed fleet is a tragedy that fades. A preserved fleet is a reminder that endures. Every species that sent ships into our space can look at this moon and see the exact cost of their decision. Undamaged, undeniable, frozen in the moment of their overreach. The crews from the Silence of Five, you did the same to them. We returned them to their home systems, with their ships intact and their memories removed. We gave them back everything except the knowledge of how easily we took it. That should have been sufficient. That should have taught the lesson. It did not. And the solace of Keth. Ambassador Gale believed we were extinct. He crossed our border to claim territory he assumed was empty. We allowed him to enter, because stopping him at the border would have confirmed our presence without demonstrating our capability. Instead, we let him come. We showed him nothing, and then we showed him everything. He simply will not remember it when he wakes. I stood in that dark corridor, listening to a voice that resonated through solid metal, and I asked the question that had been forming in my mind since I first read the handwritten annotation in the classified archive. You could have destroyed the fleet 40 years ago. You could have destroyed this ship. You have the capability to do anything you want to any vessel that enters your space. Why do you choose restraint? The voice was quiet for a moment. When it spoke again, there was something in its tone that I had not heard before. Not arrogance, something closer to weariness. Because destruction is easy. Any species can destroy. It requires no sophistication, no understanding, no wisdom. You point energy at matter, and the matter comes apart. We moved past that a long time ago. What we do instead is harder and more lasting. We preserve, we catalog, we remember. And when a species needs to understand the consequences of its actions, we provide them with a mirror rather than a weapon. I felt the weight of that answer settle over me. Then I asked the question that Selic Orm had been asking for 40 years. Why did you go silent? The conclave sensors have shown nothing from your space for over a decade. No energy signatures, no fleet movements, no communications. Why? The voice paused. When it resumed, there was something in its tone that I could not quite identify. Not amusement, not contempt. Something closer to patience, the kind of patience that comes from having waited so long that waiting itself has become irrelevant. We did not go silent, the voice said. We stopped performing. Your species measure presence by noise. Engines, signals, fleet movements, the constant chatter of civilizations that need to see themselves reflected in the universe to know they exist. When we no longer needed those things, you assumed we had vanished. That assumption is the only reason you are still functioning as a galactic community. What do you mean by that? We mean that if you understood what we have become, the political structures that hold your conclave together would collapse under the weight of their own irrelevance. Your species maintain power through military strength, economic leverage, and diplomatic maneuvering. We have moved beyond all three. We do not need warships because we can interface with any machine ever built. We do not need trade because we can assemble anything we require from raw matter. We do not need diplomacy because no agreement you could offer us has value we cannot create ourselves. Your entire civilization operates on principles we abandoned generations ago. If you truly understood that, you would either despair or you would attack us out of fear, and we do not wish to provoke either response. So we stopped performing. We let you believe we were gone, and for a decade it worked. I wanted to argue. I wanted to find a flaw in the logic, a crack in the certainty. But I could not, because I was standing inside a ship that had been shut down like a light switch by an unseen hand, on a moon surrounded by centuries of similarly collected vessels, listening to a voice that spoke through solid matter without any visible source. "Tell the conclave," the voice said, and now its tone carried an edge I had not heard before, something cold and final, that the border is not a wall, it is our patience, and they should be grateful that it holds. The vibration faded. The corridor fell silent. I stood there for a long time, alone with 64 sleeping crew members and the weight of everything I had just heard. Then I began waking them up. The crew of the Solace of Keth woke slowly, one at a time, blinking into consciousness with the confused, sluggish disorientation of people emerging from a sleep far deeper than normal rest. I started with the medical officer, a compact Selkathi woman named Prin Delir, because I needed someone who could assess the crew's condition before I started rousing everyone else. Prin came to with a gasp, her eyes wide and unfocused. She grabbed my arm with a grip that was stronger than I expected, and looked at me as if I were the first face she had seen in years. "Where are we?" she asked. "On a moon in human space. You have been asleep for 18 standard days. Your ship crossed the perimeter." She stared at me. 18 days? "Your crew is alive. All 64. I need you to start checking their condition. Can you do that?" She could. She did. Over the next 3 hours, Prin and I moved through the residential deck, waking crew members and running basic medical scans. The results were identical across every individual. Perfect physical health. No injuries. No chemical residue. No signs of malnutrition or dehydration, despite 18 days of unconsciousness. And no memories of anything after the ship crossed the perimeter. The last thing every crew member remembered was the moment the border coordinates appeared on the navigation display. After that, nothing. A gap in their lives as clean and precise as a surgical incision. Ambassador Gale was the last person I woke. He came to consciousness with the abrupt, sharp alertness of a man who never allowed himself to appear vulnerable, and his first words were a demand. "Who authorized this recovery? Where is Captain Vol?" "Captain Vol is in the command center. He has no memory of the last 18 days. Neither does anyone else aboard this ship." Gale sat up, straightening his diplomatic sash with mechanical precision. "Then we need to determine what happened. My mission log should contain a full record of everything after we crossed the perimeter. Your mission log ends at minute 12 of your incursion. Everything after that is blank." I watched the implications register on his face. For a brief moment, something that might have been fear flickered behind his eyes. Then the political armor reasserted itself, and he stood up with the practiced composure of a man who had spent his career never admitting that he was wrong about anything. "We need to get this ship operational and return to conclave space. Whatever happened here, the Council needs to be informed immediately." I did not tell him about the voice. I did not tell him about the library. I did not tell him about the hundreds of ships arranged on the surface of the moon around us. I would include all of it in my official report, but Ambassador Gale was not my chain of command, and something told me that the less he knew before we crossed back into safe space, the better. Getting the Solace of Keth operational proved simpler than I expected. The moment Captain Vol entered the command center and sat down in his chair, every system aboard the ship came to life simultaneously. Lights, displays, navigation, communications, engines. Life support returned to full power. Weapons systems initialized and reported ready status. It was as if the ship had been waiting for its captain to take his seat before it remembered how to function. I wondered if the humans were watching. I wondered if they had simply released their hold on the ship because I had done what they expected, or if the ship's sudden awakening was itself a demonstration, another reminder that they could turn any machine on or off at will. I returned to my shuttle and followed the Solace of Keth off the surface of the moon. As we climbed away, I looked down through my viewport at the collection of ships below us. Hundreds of vessels from dozens of species, arranged in their silent circles, their hulls reflecting the dim light of the distant gas giant. "A library," the voice had said. "A collection of lessons." I wondered how many species had sent ships into human space over the centuries. I wondered how many of those species still existed. I wondered if any of them remembered what they had lost. The return trip was uneventful. My navigation system, which had been overridden on the way in, returned to my control the instant we crossed back over the perimeter. The solace of Keth's systems behaved normally for the entire journey. Whatever authority had controlled them inside human space had released its hold the moment we crossed the line, as cleanly and completely as if it had never been there. We docked at Perimeter Station to find the place transformed. When I had left, the station had held a skeleton crew of monitoring personnel. Now it was crowded with conclave officials, military advisors, intelligence analysts, and political operatives who had arrived during my absence. The corridors hummed with urgent conversation, and armed guards stood at every major junction. The atmosphere was tense and electric, the kind of energy that builds in enclosed spaces when too many important people are forced to wait for information they do not have. I delivered my report in a closed session with the Conclave's Emergency Council. I told them everything: the moon, the ships, the voice, the message. I held nothing back, because holding things back from a governing body that was deciding whether to provoke a species capable of controlling machines with their thoughts seemed like an exceptionally poor strategic decision. The reaction was not what I expected. Half the council listened with visible concern. These were the delegates whose species had participated in the Silence of Five, or whose military advisors had studied the event closely enough to understand its implications. They heard my report, and they recognized the pattern: power beyond comprehension, exercised with restraint, demonstrated through capability rather than violence. The other half did not believe me. The Krithani delegate spoke first. A voice in the air? Ships parked on a moon like trophies in a case? Courier Drask, this reads like the fever dream of a man who spent too long in an environment suit, breathing recycled air. Where is the physical evidence? Where are the independent sensor logs that confirm what you claim to have seen? I transmitted my shuttle's complete sensor archive to this council before the session began, I said. The logs show the navigational override, the moon, the ships, and the atmospheric vibrations, the consistent with the voice I described. Atmospheric vibrations can be fabricated. A navigational override can be simulated. And a moon full of parked ships proves nothing, except that someone has been collecting derelict vessels. This could be an automated defense system, running on legacy programming. It could be a psychological operation, designed to prevent us from entering space, that is no longer defended. It could be anything other than the omnipotent presence you are describing. The hegemony delegate leaned forward. The star chart they sent us showed the location of every classified installation in the sector. That alone should concern this council, regardless of what we think about Courier Drask's account. Old data, the Krithani delegate said with a dismissive wave. Possibly decades out of date, possibly fabricated entirely to create the impression of surveillance capability that does not exist. We are allowing ourselves to be frightened by stagecraft. I looked around the room and saw the fracture forming in real time. The species that remembered the Silence of Five were cautious. The species that had risen to prominence after it, that had never felt the weight of human capability pressing against their borders, were dismissive. They had grown up in a galaxy where the humans were a story, a cautionary tale told to cadets, not a living force. And stories, no matter how terrifying, eventually become just words. Ambassador Gale was at the center of the dismissive faction. Despite having been found unconscious in a ship that had been shut down by unknown means and parked on a moon in hostile territory, he remained convinced that the humans were operating from weakness. His argument was elegant in its wrongness. If the humans possessed the power I described, he said, they would use it. They would project force. They would make demands. They would impose their will on the galactic community. The fact that they had not done so proved that they could not. The silence was a bluff. The technology I had witnessed was limited, localized, perhaps even automated, the remnants of a defense system maintained by machines long after its creators had disappeared. Several council members began to nod. I watched heads moving in agreement and felt something close to despair. I stood up. Ambassador Gale, you were unconscious for 18 days. Your ship was moved to a moon deep inside human space, parked alongside hundreds of other captured vessels, and your entire crew was kept alive and healthy without any action on your part. Does that sound like the work of a legacy defense system? Gale smiled the thin, practiced smile of a man who has been winning arguments his entire life. It sounds like the work of an automated system doing exactly what it was programmed to do. Capture, contain, preserve. A sophisticated machine, certainly, but a machine nonetheless. Machines do not make policy. Machines do not project force. And machines can be overcome. He turned to the full council. I propose a reconnaissance in force. A fleet large enough to map the extent of human space and determine, once and for all, whether humanity represents a genuine threat or a historical footnote. If we find a functioning civilization, we negotiate from a position of strength. If we find ruins and automated defenses, we claim the territory under conclave salvage law. Either way, we stop cowering behind a line that was drawn by fear and maintained by inertia. The vote was not held that day, but I could count the supporters. The Krithani were in favor. 3 of the smaller delegations were in favor. 2 more were leaning that direction. The Torvathi delegate still had not spoken, and his silence was beginning to look less like caution and more like resignation, the silence of someone who knows what is coming and has accepted that he cannot prevent it. I pulled up the star chart the humans had sent and displayed it on the main screen. This intelligence represents a complete penetration of conclave military security, I said. Every classified installation, every deployment, every patrol route. If the humans can acquire this level of detail from inside a sealed border, what do you imagine they will do when you send 1,800 warships into their territory? They will do what they did to the Solace of Keth, the Krithani delegate said. Shut them down, put the crews to sleep, park them on a moon, and then we will have confirmed the limits of their capability. If all they can do is sedate and relocate, then they are not a military threat. They are a nuisance with impressive technology. I stared at him. You are volunteering 1,800 crews to be test subjects. I am volunteering them to be explorers. The difference is a matter of perspective. The session adjourned without a final vote, but the outcome was already decided. I could see it in the body language of the delegates, in the quiet conversations happening in the corridors outside the council chamber, in the military communications traffic that Selic Orm had been monitoring from his station. I found Selic Orm in the lower observation deck that evening, in the same spot where I always found him, standing at the viewport with his prosthetic hand pressed against the glass. They are going to cross, I said. I know. I intercepted the military communications from 6 conclave member species, fleet repositioning orders, supply chain activations, transport contracts for munitions and fuel. This is not a proposal anymore, Drask. The machinery has been running since before you crossed the perimeter. Your report was supposed to confirm Gale's theory that human space was empty and ripe for claiming. When it did not, they simply decided your report was wrong and proceeded with the plan they had already set in motion. They are going to get those crews killed, or worse. Selic Orm turned from the viewport and looked at me with eyes that held 40 years of watching this exact scenario assemble itself. I stood at this viewport and watched 1,200 ships cross that line 4 decades ago. I watched them go dark one by one, like a flame moving down a corridor. I felt something on the other side of that border notice me, consider me, and decide I was not worth the effort. And then I spent 40 years watching this station, waiting for the Galaxie to remember what it cost. He shook his head slowly. They forgot. They always forget. And this time, I do not think the humans will simply put them to sleep. The fleet assembled over the next 72 hours. I watched it happen from Perimeter Station's observation deck, where I had taken to spending my days since the council dismissed my report. Ships arrived in groups of 20 and 30, dropping out of transit in bright flashes of displaced energy, and forming up in the staging area 2 light hours from the border. Krithani battlecruisers with their angular, aggressive hulls. Torvathi dreadnoughts, massive and slow, and bristling with weapons platforms. Hegemony frigates running in tight wolfpack formations. Vareshi electronic warfare platforms trailing sensor arrays like enormous tentacles, and ships from 2 other species, the Neth Aggregate and the Dominion of Thrace, who had not been part of the original coalition, but had decided that this time they wanted a share of whatever was on the other side. 1,800 warships in total, 50% more than the fleet that had vanished into silence 40 years ago. the largest military force assembled in conclave space in living memory. Ambassador Gale had been given operational command of the diplomatic contingent attached to the fleet, which meant he was technically aboard in an advisory capacity, but was functionally directing the mission's political objectives. The military commander was a Krythani admiral named Severin Cole, a career officer with a spotless combat record who had never fought a battle he could not win through numerical superiority, and who, as far as I could tell, had never encountered a problem he could not solve with the application of more firepower. I made one final attempt to stop it. I compiled my complete report, including the raw sensor data from my shuttle, the archived files from the Silence of Five, Selic Orm's personal testimony, and my own account of the voice on the moon. I packaged it with the star chart the humans had sent, and the biometric data showing the solace of Keth's crew alive and asleep. I transmitted it on every public communications channel in the sector, unclassified and unredacted. I sent it to news services on 30 worlds, to academic institutions, to military academies, to independent analysts, and to every member of the Conclave Council who might still have the courage to listen. The Conclave jammed the transmission within minutes. Their communications infrastructure was faster and more powerful than mine, but fragments of the report escaped. Pieces of it reached the public networks before the jamming took effect. Partial accounts, truncated files. Enough to generate questions on a dozen worlds, but not enough to generate the kind of political pressure that could stop a fleet already in motion. It did not matter. The fleet was already moving. I stood at the viewport and watched 1,800 warships form up in their approach columns and begin their advance toward the perimeter. Selic Orm stood beside me, silent and still, his prosthetic hand at his side. Around us, the station's monitoring staff tracked the fleet on their sensor displays with the focused attention of people watching an event they could not prevent and could not look away from. The fleet crossed the perimeter at 1600 hours station time. For the first 20 minutes, the advance proceeded without incident. The fleet maintained perfect formation, a wall of metal and energy stretching across thousands of kilometers of space. Communications chatter was crisp and professional. Weapons were hot and cycling through continuous readiness checks. Sensors showed empty space ahead, just as they had 40 years ago. No human ships, no defenses, no energy signatures, nothing. Admiral Cole's flagship, the Krythani battle carrier Sovereign Judgment, broadcast regular status updates to Perimeter Station on the open channel. All systems nominal, no contacts, no anomalies. Advancing on planned heading, space is clear. I listened to his updates and felt nothing but dread. I had heard the voice on the moon. I had stood in the library of captured ships. I knew what was waiting for them in that empty space, and it was not nothing. It was something so vast and so patient that it did not need to announce itself until it was ready. Minute 21. The first anomaly appeared. 3 ships in the forward screen reported minor navigational deviations. Their heading corrections were being delayed by fractions of a second, as if the navigation computers were processing an additional calculation before executing each command. The captains reported it as a sensor calibration issue and adjusted manually. At minute 22, 18 more ships reported the same anomaly, then 50, then 200. Within 60 seconds, every ship in the fleet was experiencing navigational lag. Not enough to disrupt the formation. Just enough to be noticed. Just enough to make every captain aboard wonder why their ships were not responding quite as quickly as they should. Admiral Cole ordered a fleet-wide diagnostic. The results came back clean. Every system aboard every ship reported full functionality. There was nothing wrong. The ships were simply thinking about something else before they obeyed their crews. Minute 23. Every ship in the fleet received a transmission simultaneously. Not from the perimeter. Not from any detectable source, not from any direction that the communications officers could identify. The transmission appeared directly in each vessel's communication buffer, as if it had been generated internally, born from the ship's own circuits. It was a data file. Each ship received a different file, and each file contained that ship's own complete technical schematic. Hull composition down to the molecular level, shield frequencies, including the classified rotation algorithms that were supposed to change every 6 hours. Reactor specifications, including the fuel mixture ratios, that were considered state secrets by 3 different species. Weapons systems, including modifications that had been installed in sealed facilities under military supervision, modifications that had never been documented in any digital system because the engineers had been ordered to work from physical blueprints that were destroyed after installation. Crew complement, including the names, ranks, biometric profiles, medical histories, and personal communications of every person aboard. Life support configuration, including atmospheric mix, temperature settings, water purification processes, and the chemical composition of the food supply. The message was not subtle. We are inside your systems. We have been inside since the moment you crossed the line. We know everything about your ships. We know everything about your crews. We know the secrets you buried in physical paperwork and thought were safe from digital intrusion. Nothing you have built is closed to us. Nothing you have hidden is hidden from us. And you did not detect us because we are not an intrusion. We are a fact of your existence that you were never equipped to perceive. Admiral Cole ordered his communications officer to trace the origin of the transmission. The officer reported, his voice unsteady for the first time, that there was no origin. The files had been generated by the ship's own computers, using processes that were not part of their installed software. The ships had created the files themselves, as if their own systems had been asked to write a confession and had complied without hesitation or resistance. Minute 25. The fleet stopped. Not because Admiral Call ordered it, not because any commander in any ship gave any command. Every engine aboard every ship in the fleet cycled down to idle simultaneously. Weapons systems entered diagnostic mode. Shield generators began running self-tests that their crews had not initiated. Sensor arrays recalibrated themselves. Communications equipment ran frequency sweeps across bands that the fleet did not use and had never been programmed to access. The ships were not disabled. They were being examined. Every system aboard every vessel was being tested, evaluated, cataloged, and then returned to standby. The crews could do nothing but sit at their stations and watch their own instruments cycle through functions they had not commanded, reading outputs they had not requested, responding to an authority they could not see and could not challenge. I watched this happen on perimeter stations' sensor displays, 2 light hours away, and I recognized the pattern. It was the same thing that had happened to the Coalition fleet 40 years ago. The same gentle, irresistible seizure of control. The same methodical examination. But this time, something was different. Last time, the humans had put the crews to sleep and sent them home. This time, they were leaving the crews awake. They wanted them to see what was happening. They wanted them to watch. The examination took 3 minutes. When it was finished, every system aboard every ship returned to idle status and waited. Admiral Cole attempted to issue an order. His command console accepted his input, but did not execute it. The flagship's computer displayed a single line of text on every screen aboard, in the Krithani script that only the flagship's crew could read. It said, "Please wait." Across the fleet, every ship received the same message in its own crew's language. Please wait. Not a threat. Not an ultimatum. A request, delivered with the calm politeness of someone who knows that the request is not optional. Minute 28. The voice returned. It broadcast on every frequency, in every language used by every species in the fleet, simultaneously. It was the same voice I had heard on the moon, calm, measured, patient, but this time, it carried an edge that had not been there before. Not anger, something colder than anger, something closer to the particular disappointment of a teacher who had given a clear lesson and watched it be ignored. 40 years ago, we showed you mercy and called it a lesson. You forgot the lesson. So now we will teach you cost. Admiral Cole lunged for his weapons console. It did not respond. No weapons system in any ship in the fleet responded. Across 1,800 vessels, commanders and weapons officers, and tactical specialists hammered at controls that acknowledged their inputs and refused to execute them. The ship sat in the darkness of human space, fully powered, fully functional, and completely unresponsive to anything their crews tried to do. The voice continued. We do not wage war. War is the tool of species that have not yet learned to resolve conflict without destroying value. We learned that lesson long ago. So, instead of destroying your fleet, which we could do in the time it takes you to draw a breath, we will give you something far more damaging than weapons fire. We will give you the truth. Every ship in the fleet received a second data dump. This one was not technical specifications. It was communications intercepts. 40 years of classified military communications from all 6 species in the coalition, decoded, organized, annotated, and cross-referenced with a thoroughness that no intelligence agency in the conclave could have matched. The files contained everything. Every secret operation that each species had conducted against its supposed allies over 4 decades of supposed cooperation. Every classified project that had been hidden from the Conclave Council. Every backroom agreement. Every betrayal. Every manipulation. Every lie that the 6 coalition members had told each other while standing side by side at conclave meetings and signing mutual defense treaties. The Chthoni received proof that the hegemony of Selkath had been secretly negotiating with a rival power to annex Chthoni border worlds once the incursion into human space was complete. The plan was detailed and comprehensive, signed by hegemony officials at the highest level of government, and included timetables for military action against Chthoni territory that were scheduled to begin within 1 year of the human campaign's conclusion. The Torvathi received intercepts showing that 3 of their allied species had sold the positions of Torvathi fleet deployments to a hostile intelligence service during the original Silence of 5. The Torvathi ships had been the first to go dark because their allies had told the humans exactly where they would be and exactly when they would cross the perimeter. The hegemony received evidence that the Chthoni had been developing biological agents specifically designed around Selkathi genetic vulnerabilities, hidden in a research facility that the Conclave's weapons inspectors had certified as clean just 2 years ago. The research was advanced. The agents were viable. The Chthoni had been preparing to eliminate the hegemony as a political rival, while publicly calling them an essential ally. The Vareshi discovered that their electronic warfare capabilities, which they had considered their greatest strategic advantage and their primary contribution to the coalition, had been completely compromised by a Dominion intelligence operation that had been running for 15 years. Every encryption key, every protocol, every classified algorithm, every countermeasure was in Dominion hands. The Vareshi had been operating under the assumption that their systems were impenetrable, while the Dominion read every communication they sent. The Neth Aggregate, the newest member of the coalition, received a dossier showing that every other member had privately agreed to exclude them from any territorial gains, planning to use their fleet as expendable screening forces in the vanguard, while the more established species claimed the valuable systems behind them. And every species received a comprehensive file on the others, showing exactly how much contempt, duplicity, and predatory calculation had been hiding behind the polite language of alliance and cooperation and shared purpose. The coalition fractured in real time. I watched it happen on perimeter stations' sensor displays, and even from 2 light hours away, the collapse was visible in the telemetry. Ships that had been holding formation side by side began to drift apart. Communications channels that had been carrying orderly tactical updates erupted with accusations, threats, and demands for explanation in half a dozen languages. The Chthoni flagship aimed its weapons at the nearest hegemony vessel. The Torvathi dreadnoughts broke formation entirely and began moving toward the perimeter, their captains apparently deciding that retreat from human space was more important than maintaining an alliance with species that had sold their positions to the enemy. 3 ships opened fire. A Chthoni destroyer and a hegemony frigate exchanged weapons fire across a distance of less than 1,000 meters, their crews screaming accusations at each other over open channels while their weapons, suddenly responsive again, tore into each other's hulls. A Vareshi electronic warfare platform, realizing that the Dominion knew every one of its countermeasures and that its entire defense architecture was compromised, panicked, and launched a full electronic attack against every ship within range, friend and hostile alike, trying to blind everyone before someone used its own systems against it. The formation dissolved into chaos. Ships that had crossed the perimeter as allies were now treating each other as enemies, and the humans had not fired a single weapon to achieve it. They had simply held up a mirror and let the coalition see what it actually was. Not an alliance. A collection of predators who had been circling each other for decades, waiting for the right moment to strike. The voice spoke one final time. Your ships will be returned to your borders. Your crews will be unharmed. Your secrets are now public record across every communications network your species maintain. This is the cost of crossing our space. Not death. Truth. And truth, unlike war, cannot be recovered from. The fleet's engines reactivated, not under the crew's control. Each ship's navigation system plotted a course back to the perimeter, and each ship began moving along that course regardless of what its crew wanted. Ships that had been shooting at each other were gently separated and pointed in different directions. Damaged vessels were given priority routing and slower speeds. The entire fleet was sorted, organized, and guided back across the line with the calm efficiency of a librarian reshelving books after closing time. The ships crossed the perimeter and were released. Their systems returned to crew control the moment they entered conclave space, but by then, the damage was done. The classified communications were already propagating through the fleet's internal networks, through the public channels that the humans had simultaneously uploaded them to, through every data system that any of the 6 species maintained. Captains were confronting captains. Admirals were demanding explanations from their governments. 3 species had severed diplomatic relations before the last ship cleared the border. 2 others had recalled their ambassadors to the conclave for emergency consultations. The coalition had not been defeated. It had been dissolved, melted from the inside by the simple, devastating application of truth. I stood at the viewport of Perimeter Station and watched the fleet scatter into the darkness, each species' ships breaking away from the others and fleeing toward home with the frantic speed of allies who had just discovered they were surrounded by enemies. Not enemies from beyond the perimeter, enemies they had been standing beside the entire time. Selic Orm stood beside me. Neither of us spoke for a long time. Finally, I activated my personal log and began to record. This is Valen Drask, diplomatic courier, filing a personal assessment for the record. The conclave will survive this. The institution is older than any single alliance, and more resilient than any single betrayal. But the coalition of 6 is finished. The trust between those species took centuries to build, and the humans dismantled it in 3 minutes, using nothing but the species' own words. I paused and looked out at the empty space beyond the perimeter. It looked the same as it always did. Dark, silent, giving nothing away. They told us the border was their patience. We tested it. And now I understand what they meant. The humans did not fear our fleets. They never feared our fleets. They feared what they would have to show us about ourselves if we forced their hand. Not our weaknesses. Our betrayals. The ugly, petty, self-serving machinery that runs behind the polished surface of every alliance and every agreement and every treaty we have ever signed. I looked at the sensor display, where the last of the retreating ships was disappearing from range, each one trailing damaged pride and shattered assumptions in its wake. The galaxy will not forget this lesson, not because of what the humans did to us, because of what they made us see. Every species in that fleet now knows the truth about every other species in that fleet, and that knowledge will reshape galactic politics for generations. The humans did not conquer us. They did not need to. They simply held up a mirror and let us see what we really are. I closed the log and turned away from the viewport. Behind me, the perimeter line glowed steady red on the sensor display, exactly as it had for 40 years. On the far side, the silence continued. Not the silence of absence, not the silence of weakness. The silence of something so vast and so patient that the rest of the galaxy was nothing more than a minor disturbance in an otherwise quiet afternoon. I thought about the voice on the moon. I thought about its words. The border is not a wall. It is our patience. I hoped, with every fiber of my being, that no one would test that patience again. But looking at the fractured, scattered, betrayed remnants of the coalition fleeing through the darkness toward their separate homes, each species nursing wounds that no medical technology could heal, I realized that the humans had ensured it. You cannot build a coalition against someone when you no longer trust the species standing beside you. You cannot plan an incursion when your allies might be selling your fleet positions to the same intelligence you are trying to invade. You cannot threaten a border when the thing behind that border knows your secrets better than you do and has already shown a willingness to share them with the galaxy. The humans had not built a wall. They had not needed to. They had turned the galaxy into its own wall, and every species that had crossed the line was now a brick in the barrier, held in place not by force, but by the simple, devastating, inescapable weight of truth. Selig Orm placed his prosthetic hand on the viewport one final time, staring out at the dark. 40 years, he said quietly. 40 years I watched this border, waiting for the galaxy to remember the cost. Now they remember. He lowered his hand and walked away from the viewport, his footsteps echoing in the empty observation deck. I stayed a moment longer, looking at the line. Then I followed him, leaving the deck empty except for the hum of instruments and the steady, patient glow of the perimeter, holding its silence, holding its secrets, holding its patience for as long as the galaxy needed to learn.